The wind didn't just howl. It screamed like a wounded animal, clawing at the loose tin of the shed. Inside, Silas stood with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark to reveal the one thing he couldn't stomach: more mouths to feed. A starving mother dog, her ribs a roadmap of neglect, stared back at him with eyes that held no accusation, only desperate hope. Beneath her trembling body, 5 tiny pulses of life, puppies not even a week old, shivered against the damp floor, their pink mouths opening and closing in silent need. Silas didn't see a miracle. He saw a nuisance, another burden in a life already crushed under the weight of failure. With a heart turned to stone by his own ruin, he pointed a finger toward the pouring rain outside and uttered 2 words that should have been a death sentence: "Get out." He had no idea that this cold command was about to transform into the most haunting lesson of his life, a night that would force him to witness what true sacrifice looks like and confront the question he'd been running from for years. What kind of man throws mercy out into a storm? If you believe that every dog deserves a voice, hit the subscribe button now to join a community that listens to the silent cries of our best friends. Dawn came reluctantly, the sky bruised and gray. Silas hadn't slept. Not really. He'd drifted in and out of a restless half-consciousness, always jerking awake at phantom sounds that weren't there anymore. When pale light finally crept through his dirty windows, he forced himself out of bed, his body heavy with dread that tasted like guilt. The house was freezing. The electricity had been cut off 2 weeks ago. He wrapped himself in a threadbare blanket and shuffled to the kitchen, but the sight of those past due notices scattered across the table made his stomach turn. 43 years old, and this is what he'd become: a man who couldn't even keep the lights on, who had nothing left to lose except the last shreds of his dignity. He made instant coffee with lukewarm water from the tap. As he lifted it to his lips, he caught his reflection in the window. The face staring back was hollow-eyed, a ghost wearing his skin. Last night replayed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He'd found the mother dog and her newborns sheltering in his shed during the worst storm in years. His rage at the world, at his failures, at everything, it had boiled over. He'd forced them out, all of them, into the freezing rain and howling wind. The mother had carried each puppy out one by one, her skeletal body trembling with effort, while he stood there with a stick, herding them like vermin. At 3:17 a.m., the crying had stopped. The silence was worse than any sound. Outside, water dripped from the eaves in a steady rhythm, each drop a small accusation. Silas stood at the window, gripping his mug so tight his knuckles went white. Part of him was grateful he couldn't see the yard from here. The other part, the part he'd been trying to drown for years, whispered that he needed to look, needed to face what he'd done. The eviction played over in his mind, the way the mother dog had looked at him with pleading eyes. How her body had trembled as she carried each puppy into the storm, the smallest one slipping from her mouth into a puddle. That image wouldn't leave him. He'd told himself he was being practical, that he couldn't afford to care for himself, let alone 6 animals, that the world had shown him no mercy, so why should he give any? But standing there in the gray morning light, those justifications felt as hollow as his reflection. He couldn't avoid it any longer. Silas set down his mug and grabbed his coat, still damp from last night, smelling of mildew. His boots squelched as he stepped outside, and immediately the devastation hit him. The storm had been merciless. Broken branches littered the yard like bones. His fence had collapsed in places. A river of mud ran through what used to be his garden, and there, in the middle of the flooded yard, was a gray mound, motionless, soaked. His heart dropped into his stomach. Silas's feet moved without permission, splashing through puddles, slipping in the mud. As he got closer, the shape became clearer. Fur matted into clumps, one paw extended as if reaching for something that would never come. The mother dog. She wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. At least, that's what he thought until he was close enough to see the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. Silas dropped to his knees in the mud, the cold water soaking through his jeans instantly. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch her fur. It was ice cold, soaked through to the skin. She didn't respond to his touch, didn't open her eyes. For a moment, he was certain she was dead. Then he felt it, a weak, rattling breath that seemed to take all her remaining strength. "No," he whispered, the word breaking in his throat. "No, no, no." With shaking hands, he carefully lifted her head, and that's when he saw them. Underneath her body, in the small depression she'd carved into the mud, were all 5 puppies, warm, dry, alive. They squirmed against each other, their tiny mouths opening in silent mews. The mother had positioned herself over them like a living tent, her body taking every drop of rain, every gust of freezing wind. She'd given them everything, her warmth, her strength, her very life. And they'd survived because of it. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. This dog, this starving, abandoned creature he'd thrown out into a storm, had shown more love, more sacrifice, more pure goodness in one night than he'd managed in years. Something broke inside him then, not like glass shattering, but like ice cracking, like a dam finally giving way. A sound tore from his throat, half sob, half animal howl. Tears he hadn't shed in years spilled hot down his cold cheeks. "I'm sorry," he choked out, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "God, I'm so sorry." He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shivering body, then gathered the puppies, tucking them against his chest where they immediately began rooting for warmth. The mother dog was dead weight in his arms, her body limp and unresponsive. For a terrifying moment he thought he was too late, but then he felt that breath again, weak but there, still there. Silas ran. He ran through the mud, slipping and nearly falling, the puppies squeaking against his chest, the mother's body bouncing limply in his arms. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he didn't stop, not until he burst through his front door and laid her gently on the floor. Inside, Silas moved with a frantic energy he didn't know he still possessed. He grabbed every dry blanket he owned, all 3 of them, thin and worn, and created a nest on the floor near the fireplace. The mother dog lay motionless as he positioned her carefully, her breathing so shallow he had to put his ear to her chest just to confirm her heart was still beating. The puppies, now freed from his coat, immediately began crawling toward their mother, their blind instincts leading them, but she had nothing to give. Silas ran to the kitchen, his mind racing. What did dogs eat? What would help? He had almost nothing. His cupboards had been bare for days, but there, in the back, he found a can of tuna he'd been saving for an emergency. This qualified. He dumped it into a bowl, added some water to make it easier to swallow, and knelt beside the mother. "Come on," he whispered. "Please, you didn't give up on them. Don't give up now." He carefully lifted her head and brought the bowl to her nose. At first, nothing. Then, so slight he almost missed it, her nostrils flared. Her tongue emerged dry and cracked, and she took one weak lap. Then another. The space heater was dead, but Silas still had matches. He threw every piece of wood he could find into the fireplace. Old magazines, broken furniture, even some of the past due notices from the table. They caught quickly, flames leaping to life, and for the first time in weeks, real warmth filled the room. He positioned the mother and her puppies as close as he dared, watching as the heat slowly brought color back to her gums. Hour by hour she improved. By noon, she could lift her head. By afternoon, she was letting her puppies nurse, though Silas knew she had little to give. He sat beside them the entire time, watching, waiting, silently begging whatever God might be listening for forgiveness he didn't deserve. At one point, her eyes opened, just barely, just enough to find his face, and in that look there was no accusation, no anger, just exhaustion and perhaps impossibly gratitude. Silas's throat tightened. "I almost killed you," he whispered into his hands. "All of you." But she was alive. They were all alive. And for the first time in years, so was something inside him. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of desperate action. Silas walked 3 miles to the food bank and swallowed his pride to ask for dog food. He sold his television to a pawn shop and bought vitamins, proper puppy formula, and a bag of kibble. He filled out job applications he'd been too defeated to touch, called numbers he'd been too proud to dial. The mother dog, whom he'd started calling Sentry because of the way she'd stood guard over her babies, grew stronger each day. Her eyes cleared. Her body filled out. The puppies doubled in size, their eyes beginning to open, revealing curious blue stares that seemed to see right through him. One evening, as Silas sat on the floor beside them, Sentry did something that made his breath catch. She lifted her head from her puppies and placed it on his knee. Just rested it there, her eyes closing in what could only be called trust. Trust he hadn't earned, trust he didn't deserve, but trust she gave freely anyway, as if she understood that second chances weren't about deserving them. They were about what you did with them once they arrived. Months later, the house didn't look much different from the outside. The fence was still broken in places, the roof still leaked. But inside, everything had changed. Silas had found work, hard, physical labor at a construction site that left his back aching and his hands blistered. It didn't pay much, but it paid enough for food, enough for electricity, enough to matter. The past due notices were gone, replaced by photos, Sentry and her puppies at various stages of growth. He'd found homes for 4 of them, good homes with families who promised to send updates. He'd kept the smallest one, the runt who'd fallen in the puddle that night, named her Hope, because that's what she was. Sentry sat by the fire, a real fire now, warm and crackling, her coat shining with health, her body strong. She was beautiful, Silas realized. She'd been beautiful all along, he'd just been too blind to see it. As he sat beside her, his hand running through her soft fur, Sentry turned and licked his wrist. A simple gesture, forgiveness wrapped in trust, love wrapped in acceptance. He'd given her a home, yes, fed her, cared for her, kept her warm, but she'd given him something far more valuable. She'd given him back his humanity, shown him that sacrifice wasn't weakness and love wasn't a luxury, that even in the darkest storms there was always a choice between cruelty and compassion, and that second chances, when truly embraced, could transform everything. "Thank you," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Thank you for not giving up." Sentry's tail thumped against the floor, and in the corner, Hope let out a tiny bark as if agreeing. The storm had passed. The silence was no longer terrifying, and for the first time in years, Silas was home. This mother dog was willing to give her very last breath to protect her babies from a man who had forgotten how to love. If you can walk away from this story without feeling a tug on your heart, perhaps you've forgotten too. But if you believe in mercy and second chances, prove it by subscribing now. Don't let your conscience be as cold as that storm. Join us and stand up for those who cannot speak for themselves.